Good afternoon. My name is Michael Gottesman. I'm the Deputy Director for Intramural Research at the NIH, and it's my great pleasure to introduce this year's J. Edward Rall Cultural Lecture. This lecture honors the memory of J. Edward Rall, my predecessor as Deputy Director for Intramural Research, founder of the Clinical Endocrinology Branch, who, along with his colleagues and his good friend, Jack Robbins, made many seminal contributions to thyroid physiology and pathophysiology. Ed himself was a true polymath, equally comfortable in the laboratory, in the clinic, and as a global health diplomat, or serving as a science administrator. It was Ed who, in 1984, conceived the idea of a cultural lecture to broaden the intellectual horizons of the scientists at the NIH. As a result of Ed's passion for the arts, we've had more than 30 years of truly outstanding lectures, including, most recently, Maya Angelou, Rita Dove, the Dalai Lama, Tom Friedman, Sanjay Gupta, Diane Rehm, and Yo-Yo Ma. I would like to recognize some of Ed's family in the audience: his daughter, Pia Rall, his son, Ed Rall Jr., sister-in-law, Gloria Rall, and numerous friends and colleagues from the NIH, including Ira Paston, Phil Gordon, and Jan Wolf. We are especially pleased this year to welcome Miss Barbra Streisand, the renowned, multi-talented vocal artist, actor, director, composer, and social activist. Our very own Francis Collins, director of NIH, will introduce Miss Streisand. Francis.
Good afternoon, everyone. Wonderful to see Natcher so full with so many admirers who've come here for a very special cultural lecture indeed. I want to read you something that was written a while ago about our very special cultural lecture, Barbra Streisand. This is from a while back. It was a review of something that she had done in terms of a performance at the Blue Angel. And that was 1963, and here's what the reviewer wrote. Her name is Barbra Streisand. She has a 3-octave promiscuity of range. She packs more personal dynamic power than anybody I can recall since Libby Holman or Helen Morgan. She can sing as loud as Ethel Merman and as persuasively as Lena or Ella, or as brassy as a Sophie Tucker. And only Barbra Streisand can turn Cry Me a River into something comparable to Enrico Caruso. When Streisand cries you a river, you got a river, Sam. And she will be around 50 years from now if good songs are still written to be sung by good singers. Well, she is still around, more than 50 years after that was written, still singing great songs written by great songwriters and all the other things that they didn't know about in 1963. But which we have all had the chance to observe and experience in terms of her many other roles. It's Women's Health Week, y'all, and I can think of no person better to mark the occasion here at NIH than today's honored guest, because she's not only an icon and an ambassador of our country's culture, but she's also an improver of our society and also an icon for leading the cause for better health for women. I'll say a few words about her Odyssean journey that brings her back to us today at NIH, but she will have more to say, I'm sure, when she comes to address you in just a couple minutes. But it all started with Yentl. I oversimplify, of course, and Barbara will tell you more of the story, but back in 1968, when she first heard that story of Yentl, the girl who had to disguise herself as a boy to receive an education, she sought to tell that story herself in the form of a movie. Studio executives were skeptical about whether a woman could direct such a movie and oversee its budget. After countless rejections and with great reserves of perseverance, 14 years later, she began filming that amazing movie, which she not only directed, but co-produced, co-wrote, and starred in it. Yentl debuted in 1983. I remember seeing that film. I bet many of you do as well, to great critical and popular acclaim. And it was for directing this movie that Barbra received the Golden Globe. But her odyssey brought her more than the movie. Her experience in making it turned Barbra into a true champion for women's rights, which she remains to this day. Back in 1991, when the then director of the NIH, Bernadine Healy, who's the one who recruited me to NIH, by the way, wrote a commentary on recent studies that underscored the stark disparities women faced in the diagnosis and treatment of coronary heart disease, Bernadine called it the Yentl syndrome. A woman with heart disease was generally ignored until, quote, she showed that she was just like a man by having severe coronary artery disease or a myocardial infarction. Healy argued it's time for a general awakening. And you know, many things came about as a result of that. The Women's Health Initiative, many other things that have happened since. And for me now as the NIH director, I think the way in which we have figured out how to prioritize a focus on women's health is one of the most important things we've done over the last 30 years. And again, the person you're about to hear from will continue to exhort us about that, as well she should. One of the efforts that Barbra has undertaken is the formation of the Women's Heart Alliance, which has not only supported NIH research, but has also partnered with NIH to improve the heart health of HIV-positive women, which is something that we will go and visit this afternoon and go over a couple of the current protocols that are underway through NIH support. So, we are blessed indeed to have such a remarkable leader in the arts, but also in the promotion of human medicine, and particularly the need to focus on women's health. Please join me in giving a warm NIH welcome to the Rall Cultural Lecture, Ms. Barbra Streisand.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Collins, for that wonderful introduction and for your work to improve human health, including the Human Genome Project and the All of Us Precision Medicine Biobank. And thank you all for making me feel so welcome. NIH is known for its world-renowned, trailblazing medical research. The closest thing I have to a medical credential is my role in What's Up, Doc. So I'm honored to have been invited to speak about my work for gender equity in science and health through the Women's Heart Alliance and the Barbra Streisand Women's Heart Center. And I want to express my heartfelt thanks to the members of the Rall family who are here today. The fact that the Rall Cultural Lecture series exists is a tribute to the NIH community. It's also a recognition that scientists and artists have much in common. We're both obsessed with the quest for beauty, understanding, and truth. We're both seeking answers to the big questions about causes and consequences, hows and whys, origins and endings, life and death. We both see magic in the smallest details, a film cell or a stem cell. We both know the joy of the eureka moment and the agony of the dead end. And let's acknowledge that across the ages, both scientists and artists have faced skeptics and critics who try to suppress us and censor our work from the world. But we push forward. We shine the spotlight on tough issues. We put difficult challenges under the microscope. and we embrace the miracle of humanity in its fullest wonder across dimensions of age and race and ability and gender and sexual orientation. Because most of all, what links our two communities, I think, is the focus on what it means to be human. Our life's work, our passion, our purpose is improving and uplifting humanity. So it's no accident you see such mutual respect across our fields. Renaissance masters like Michelangelo and Da Vinci were students of human anatomy, and brilliant scientists have turned to the arts and culture for inspiration. I think of the late Dr. Ruth Kirstein and her piano, Dr. Collins and his guitar. Or what about Einstein? When he got stuck on a physics problem, he'd pick up his violin. He said that Mozart reconnected him to the harmony of the universe. And of course, you're aware of the growing research that connects the arts and positive health outcomes. Research that NIH is helping to lead through your Sound Health Initiative. I love that. I love that NIH hosts concerts in the clinical center atrium, a tangible way that artists and scientists help make each other better, literally. But in order for art and science together to have their greatest impact on society, we need to ensure that all people are included as creators and as subjects. We need everyone's perspective at the table and the bench in the studio and the labs. We need everybody's stories reflected in our research, in our studies, on our stages, and on our screens. We're making progress toward that greater diversity and inclusion. And if you want the evidence, look no farther than this room. But inequities and biases in the arts and sciences persist, including fair access for women who too often still find themselves overlooked and underrepresented. Think about it. Women are half the population. We're indispensable to everything that matters most. Yet our culture has normalized sexual harassment. We've normalized the wage gap. We've accepted barriers, some institutional, some invisible, to women's full participation and recognition, whether we're talking about women in Hollywood or women's representation in medical research. So over the years, I have experienced gender inequality in small ways, but it wasn't until I wanted to make a film called Yentl that I experienced it in a big way. Yentl was a story about, as Dr. Collins said, a young woman in Eastern Europe, 1904, who has to pretend she's a man in order to get an education. I had a clear vision of the film I wanted to make. I didn't think it would be that difficult. I was a so-called bankable star, and that is until I said I also wanted to direct it. And the studios kept turning me down. It was hard to convince anyone that a female actor could direct and produce, or that a woman could manage a budget, or that a mainstream audience would care about this ethnic and bookish female protagonist. Just as dismaying was the contrast I saw in perceptions of authority and ambition. There was this double standard at work, and it put women at a disadvantage. Strong men were seen as leaders and looked up to, while women, strong women, were seen as suspect and looked down upon. He was called assertive, while she was called aggressive. He was called committed. She was called controlling. Running head into this kind of bias was a life-changing moment for me, but I couldn't give up. And more important, it mobilized my commitment to women's equality. I became passionate about trying to ensure that women get the same chances in life as men. Which brings me to the NIH. Because in July 1991, as Dr. Collins was telling you about, Dr. Bernadine Healy, who was then director of the NIH, published a piece in the New England Journal of Medicine that she called the Yentl syndrome. Dr. Healy was a cardiologist, and she had found that women with heart attacks were not getting the same quality of care as men. Unless a woman's symptoms looked just like a man's, the classic crushing pain in the chest, too often she would be misdiagnosed and undertreated. Maybe she'd be told she was having a panic attack. Maybe she'd be given an antacid. Maybe she'd be sent back home, and maybe she'd never recover. Or maybe she would be found dead in her bed the next day. So, needless to say, when I first heard about the Yentl syndrome, I was intrigued. But the more I learned about women's heart health, the more astonished and upset I became. For much too long, CVD has been perceived as a man's disease, not just from the patient's point of view, but in the way it's been treated in the scientific community. Most of the research has been conducted on men, right down to primarily male mice in the lab. Most treatments and therapies were tested on men. And sex-specific differences have been neglected all the way from the lab to the ER, even though women's bodies and biology are so different, from the size of their hearts to our vascular systems to the impact of various risk factors. Dr. Collins and others at NIH, past and present, are helping to tackle these problems. But gaps in awareness, diagnosis, treatment, and support are still taking a painful toll in women's lives. Sometimes their names make the headlines. Debbie Reynolds, Carrie Fisher, Florence Henderson, Erica Garner. And yet, behind the scenes, a woman is dying of CVD roughly every 80 seconds. Those women are our mothers, our sisters, daughters, wives, and friends. And I wanted to help change that if I could. So in 2008, I got involved with the Women's Heart Center at Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles. And the center focuses on identifying female pattern heart disease and advancing specialized care for women. I wanted to raise awareness among women before they found themselves in the hospital. And I wanted to help drive policy change at every level. Because the fact is, heart disease is killing more women, actually more people, than all forms of cancer combined, which is hard for people to really understand. The rate of heart disease in younger women is climbing, and women of color are especially at risk. So in 2014, using what was known about sex differences, we created the Women's Heart Alliance. Our mission is to prevent women from needlessly dying from heart disease and stroke. And we start from the recognition that biologically, men and women are not the same. In layman's terms, we have different equipment. We have different plumbing, you know? And we advocate for funding and research so that we can understand even more and apply those breakthroughs to improve prevention, care, treatment, and outcomes for everyone. As we like to say, we want to make sure women's hearts are on everyone's minds. And I want to thank the NIH community for being such wonderful partners. You're helping level the playing field with studies that recognize women's biology as different and that make the most of every dollar invested in research. As you know, this was one of the goals of the 21st Century Cures Act, an important piece of legislation that the Women's Heart Alliance was proud to champion. Better understanding of sex differences will not only fill in critical gaps in women's health, but can improve men's health as well. A great example is the Reprieve trial that was launched in 2015, as Dr. Tony Fauci and I described in a piece that we co-authored for Health Affairs. Reprieve investigators are actively recruiting a racially and ethnically diverse group of women alongside men, and making the analysis of sex differences a key part of the study. The study will also look at how to break down barriers for more women to become clinical trial participants, which is so important if we are to have more breakthroughs in treatments and cures. Our hope is that well-designed studies such as Reprieve will someday be the norm, not the exception. But we're not there yet. We're not there yet. There's much more to be done for every American to have an equal chance to lead a healthy life. We need more funding, more sex-specific research to remedy the blind spots in our knowledge. And the time is ripe now for a great leap forward on behalf of gender equity in healthcare and in science, in the workplace, in Hollywood, in politics, media, and even at home. Because everywhere you turn today, women and their allies are stepping up and speaking out. Earlier this year, we celebrated the first anniversary of the Women's March, the single largest day of protest in our history. And the Me Too movement and Time's Up are making clear that sexual harassment will not stand. Men and women have to, in my opinion, find a new way to communicate what's acceptable and what isn't. Women are asserting the ambition and strength we've had in us all along, supporting one another through professional networks, on social media and beyond. We're no longer content to be hidden figures. Women, like men, are demanding to be valued as creators and innovators and human beings. So in that spirit, let me end by sharing a story about Katherine Johnson. If you saw the movie Hidden Figures, you will know that Katherine was one of the extraordinary NASA mathematicians who performed the complex calculations that helped a man land on the moon, and that was before there were machine computers. I met her at the White House in 2015. That was the year that we were both honored with the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Obama. And she was 97 at the time. She'll turn 100 years old this August. So in President Obama's words, Catherine was a pioneer who broke the barriers of race and gender, showing generations of young people that everyone can excel in math and science and reach for the stars. And as the author of Hidden Figures has said, her work changed our history, and her history has changed our future. So my wish for all of you is that your work, too, will make history that changes our future and that shapes a future where all women and men can live their best possible lives. So let's all keep searching for the truth. Artists and scientists, even some politicians. I couldn't resist that, I'm sorry. Keep searching for beauty in every cell. Keep pushing the boundaries of knowledge. Keep asking the questions and sharing the answers. And help make all humanity soar and reach for the stars. Thank you. Oh, thank you. That's so sweet. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Sit down.
Barbara, that was just awesome. And I think you could tell by the warmth of the response how much you touched the hearts and minds of the people gathered here on this special afternoon. And I should have at the beginning, but I now will also want to recognize James Brolin, who's here as part of this gathering. Welcome.
Yay, honey.
And I also wanted to recognize Ms. British Robinson, who's the CEO of the Women's Heart Alliance. Excuse me.
Yay, British.
So, Barbara, we have a chance for a little bit of a conversation here, and I wanted to follow up on some of the things that you said in that remarkable speech. You are, after all, a remarkable success who might have been satisfied to stick to the things that you've done as a singer, a songwriter, an actress, a filmmaker. By the way, Barbara is one of less than 20 individuals in history who has won an Academy Award, an Emmy, a Grammy, and Tony. That's called an EGOT.
An EGOT that I got.
EGOT that you got, yeah. So that's a grand slam. And still, your interests and your repertory continue to diversify, as you have shared with us in terms of your founding of the Women's Heart Alliance, aiming to prevent women from needlessly facing the risk of dying from heart disease and stroke. So you mentioned that this editorial by Bernadine Healy caught your attention, but what were the other reasons that you decided, with all of the other things you might have been doing, to focus on women's heart disease?
Well, that started a long, long time ago. In a sense, my interest in gender discrimination. Mm-hmm. I think I used to go to shul, synagogue, with my grandfather. He used to take me with him. I was about 4 or 5 years old. And I wondered why I was sitting downstairs with just the men and all the women were separated up there in the balcony. Then the first film I did for my own company, Barwood Films, 1972, it was called Up the Sandbox. And that was about a woman who was sacrificing her own career for her husband's. So it drove her into fantasies about other ways of living, you know. Then when I did Yentl, I was doing research for Yentl, I was asking myself the question, why were women being suppressed to begin with? You know, why were they relegated to roles of having to cook and clean, make babies, and so forth? That led me into thinking this about gender discrimination, you know, about why this was happening. When did the notion first begin? And I thought about maybe it started way back with the caveman who, you know, was watching his partner have a swollen belly. And then after a few months, this thing appears out of her, you know, this being, this human thing that must have absolutely frightened him, don't you think? I mean, how did she do that? It was as if she was so powerful. He was probably so awestruck that he thought she was, in a sense, a goddess, godlike or whatever, and thought that he better keep her down in order to feel better about himself. It's true. That's what I thought. And it's funny. You know, it's funny because I've told this in interviews, like with Dr. Oz or in a magazine, and he said, "You better not talk about this." I don't know why. It seems obvious in a sense, doesn't it? Also, men become dependent on the woman, I think, you know, and need her. And dependency can create resentment, anger. I hear some women going, yeah.
Amen.
That's not true. So I was so interested in this subject that in 1985 I endowed, I think it wasn't my first chair, I think it was my second, at USC, to study intimacy and sexuality between men and women in a changing society. And unfortunately, you know, we didn't have the right contract, so they didn't study it. The professor wrote a book on the gender gap between 9 and 12-year-olds. I know better now.
We give out contracts, too, and we resemble that comment occasionally.
Really. And by the way, even in the movie business, keeping women down, speaking of that, in 1916, because I made a documentary called Reel, R-E-E-L, Women, the women who started film. And in 1916, there were 12 women directors in Hollywood. 100 years later, in 2016, there were only 8. So we've gone backwards in a way. I mean, it's still very hard for women to get their films made. Did I answer your question? Or?
You answered a better question than the one I asked, but maybe I'll again ask, how did this lead to heart health as a particular focus? So many women's issues that you've been engaged in, but you've placed particular attention and focus on this one.
Well, that was in 2008, I said, didn't I? When I met Noelle, Dr. Noelle Berry Mers, who's the head of my Women's Heart Center. Yes. And Oh, I know how it happened. My friend, who was a man, my friend was one of my men friends. Yeah, they're so different, you know. One of my men friends had cardiovascular disease, and he was supposed to have an operation, and he didn't have to have it. So I said, why didn't you have to have it? And he said he met Dr. Merz, and she changed his biology around, or his whatever, with diet, exercise. And he never had, he's 90-something years old today. And he's still kicking, you know. And it made me fascinated by what she did.
And no doubt wondering, how come that doesn't happen more often?
Yeah.
And maybe particularly...
When I found out, I mean, it's very hard to believe, isn't it, that, well, now it's become 1 in 4 women die of cardiovascular disease, as compared to 1 in 32 women who die of breast cancer. So, it's not known. I mean, it's just not talked about. We have a really hard time raising funds for heart disease. Cancer is a scarier thing, but that's because a lot of women don't make it. They have a heart attack and they don't survive.
So, Barbara, you're such a legendary storyteller, and as you're talking about risks to women's health, there are stories that are out there, probably a lot of them, about women facing breast cancer. There are very few about women facing heart disease. But you have started, I think, something with us today to try to encourage a way of putting this important issue forward more effectively. And stories can be a way to do that. So is that part of what you're doing with the Heart Alliance? Yeah,
I think women are embarrassed to talk about heart disease because there's a stigma attached to it. It's known as an old man's disease in a sense. So many people think it just affects older men. But that's not true. As a matter of fact, the statistics are showing that younger women, the stats on younger women having heart disease is growing. That's like 29 to 45 years old. And women of color are especially at risk. So I don't think this is that well known.
Are there more stories that could be told? Is this your next film?
Not really. No, that's more of a documentary that we're actually thinking of. We're trying to do, maybe for HBO. Yeah.
Let's also talk about, in terms of research, the need to not only design and enroll women in clinical trials, including many of them that are focused specifically on women, but also to be sure we have a lot of researchers who themselves are women. Our workforce is more balanced in terms of men and women than it used to be, but we still have what many would call a glass ceiling, where the more senior you are, the more likely you are to be a man, and that's not just a cohort effect. That's because we see attrition of talented women as they would normally be seeing advances in their career, and it doesn't quite as easily happen. And there's a lot of reasons for that have been pointed out, but we need to figure out how to fix that. But we especially need to be sure that we're recruiting in the next generation women into science and technology and engineering and medicine, the STEM roles.
Right.
I understand that here today you have welcomed 3 young women from H.B. Woodlawn High School in Arlington who are here to be inspired by your talk. Are they here somewhere in the audience? Could you stand up? All right. That looks like the future to me. So when you're speaking to young people about the future, what kind of wisdom do you share with them? Can you share that with all of us today?
My advice would be to young women that, what would it be? It would be to follow your passion. In other words, if you can dream, if you can envision yourself doing something, then I believe you could make it happen. I used to have these dreams as a kid. You know, I just used to see myself like on a television screen, almost. You know, it was like, oh, I can see myself doing that. Yes. And I think there was a great thing that I read when I was 16 years old. It was a book by George Bernard Shaw called The Quintessence of Ibsenism. And the line that I remember most clearly is that thought transcends matter. And it just made such an impression on me. The power of thought. So I would say also you could read up on women that have had a great path, followed their paths, and became something that you admire. And, just see what that takes. I mean, try it for yourself. I mean, beyond the books even, because I think the other thing is very important, to envision your life. And because in Yentl, actually, I say, nothing's impossible. That was the logo. That was the, whatever you call that, the byline or whatever. Nothing's impossible. So here's to more women in science, in film, in colleges. Make it happen.
Beautiful. So, Barbara, I'm going to ask you in a second also if you have other messages you want to give to this audience of scientists, all the way from very basic scientists to people who are running clinical trials. We're going to have a chance to show you some of the work that's going on here shortly when we go over to the clinical center and see some of those amazing people who are doing things every day that are right at the leading edge of the possible, and many of them are women, I'm very happy to say. But I also want to thank you for the way in which, by being here, you inspire us. By the way in which you're leading your life, you inspire us. By the way in which your gifts in music and filmmaking have blessed generations. Now, I gather that you are once again working on a new album. She told me that, so I'm spilling some beans here. And we're all very much looking forward to that. But you give us hope by the way in which you've conducted yourself. I want to give you a pin, the same one that I'm wearing. It looks like a guitar pick, because it is. And but it says hope at NIH, because we think of ourselves as the National Institutes of Hope as well as the National Institutes of Health. And you, by being here today, have taken our hope up a notch. So thank you. But please, if you have some final words you want to share with this group before we drag you off to the clinical center.
Well, you helped us a lot, I must say, introducing female mice into those labs.
Yes!
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Because when I asked the question one time, I don't remember where or when, but I said, so you're also working with female mice, right, on heart disease? And they said, no. This is a while ago. And I said, why not? And they said, well, they're too complex. They have hormones. Duh. That's why you have to do work on female mice, right? I mean, so I wish you good luck with your female mice.
All right, thank you. Ms. Barbra Streisand.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Good luck. Thank you so much.